The first thing Gerald Holt did when he walked into the conference room that morning was move Dean Martin's nameplate to the far end of the table. Not subtly, not by accident. He picked it up with 2 fingers, carried it the full length of the mahogany surface, and set it down at the seat nearest the door, the seat you gave to assistants, to people whose opinions didn't matter, to people you were already planning to dismiss. His secretary watched him do it. His development executive, a nervous young man named Paul Drexler, who had worked for Holt for 3 years and had spent most of those 3 years quietly updating his resume, watched him do it. The 2 studio liaisons from Paramount watched him do it. Nobody said anything. That was the thing about Gerald Holt. He created atmospheres where saying anything felt dangerous. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been athletic and had spent 20 years eating the memory of it. With silver hair swept back from a face that had been handsome once and was now merely imposing. He wore a watch that cost more than a house in the valley. He moved through rooms away, whether moved through valleys. You didn't argue with it. You just waited for it to pass and assessed the damage afterward. He had produced 19 films. 14 of them had made money. Of those 14, film historians and industry insiders would later agree, 13 had succeeded entirely despite Gerald Holt's involvement rather than because of it. He had a talent, specific and almost supernatural, for attaching himself to projects that were already going to work, then positioning himself so thoroughly at the center of the credit that the people who had actually done the work found themselves standing in the rain outside their own party. He had also, which was a relevant fact this particular Tuesday morning in the spring of 1964, made a decision. He had decided that Dean Martin was the problem, not the only problem. The project, a crime picture set in Las Vegas, written by a man named Carter Webb who had spent 4 years on the script and had produced something genuinely extraordinary, a piece of writing that crackled with wit and darkness in equal measure, had been circling Hollywood for 2 years. It had passed through 6 producers' hands, each of whom had found reasons to let it go. Too dark, too expensive, too ambitious. The real reason, which none of them said out loud, was that the script was so good that it scared them. A script that good created expectations. Expectations created pressure. Pressure was what happened to other people. Holt had picked it up 8 months ago and had immediately seen what the others had missed. The script wasn't the problem. The script was the asset. What you needed to do was build a fortress of commercial logic around it. Stars, a director with a recognizable name, a release window that guaranteed visibility, and then quietly, methodically sand down its edges, make it safer, make it manageable, turn the thing that made it extraordinary into something that merely made it profitable. He'd attached Dean Martin first. Dean was, at this point in his career, a genuine phenomenon, a man who had somehow turned the appearance of effortlessness into an art form so refined it looped back around to genius. Audiences didn't just like Dean Martin. They trusted him. They believed somehow that he was letting them in on something private, that the performance was actually the man, that the warmth was real. It was real. That was the thing people who underestimated Dean never understood. The warmth was entirely real. It just existed inside a person who was also considerably more perceptive, considerably more precise, and considerably more dangerous than the warmth suggested. Holt had not understood this. He understood leverage. He understood contracts. He understood the mathematics of box office projections and the geometry of studio politics. He did not understand people with any particular depth, which had never previously mattered because the people he dealt with were, by and large, too dependent on him to let their actual opinions interfere with their professional behavior. Dean Martin was not dependent on Gerald Holt. This was the miscalculation, the one that would cost him everything. Clint Eastwood had been added to the project 6 weeks ago at the studio's insistence. He was coming off a string of westerns that had turned him from a television actor into something the industry was still finding words for, a new kind of American archetype, lean and quiet and radiating a violence so controlled it felt almost like stillness. The studio wanted him because his presence on the poster guaranteed a certain male demographic that Dean's audience didn't automatically include. Holt had agreed because he had no leverage to disagree, and because he had privately decided that Eastwood, who was known for being quiet in meetings, would be easier managed than he looked. This was the second miscalculation. Carter Webb had written the script in a rented room in Santa Monica, 2 blocks from the beach, In a building that smelled of salt and old carpet and the specific loneliness of people who had come to Los Angeles with ambitions they were still waiting to see confirmed. He was 38 years old, a two-time WGA nominee with one produced credit that had done modestly at the box office and had been largely forgotten, and he had spent 4 years building the script from something he understood in his bones. The way charm is a kind of armor, and the way armor, worn long enough, becomes indistinguishable from the person underneath it. The protagonist of the script, a man named Vincent Calhoun, who ran a casino in Las Vegas with the same ease and the same concealed terror that a man walks a tightrope, was not autobiographical. It was also entirely autobiographical. Every writer knows the difference. Very few can explain it. What Carter had created was a character who was genuinely funny, genuinely warm, genuinely magnetic, and underneath all of that, genuinely lost. Not in a way the character advertised, not in a way that invited pity, in a way that only became visible at specific angles, in specific lights, like a hairline fracture in something that looks solid until you look closely. The genius of the script, the thing that made it work, the thing that made readers set it down and sit quietly for a moment before picking it back up, was that the audience wasn't supposed to feel sorry for Vincent Calhoun. They were supposed to recognize him. They were supposed to see something of themselves and crack and be uncomfortable about it and keep watching anyway. This required a specific actor, not a great actor in the technical sense. Though technical greatness didn't hurt, it required someone who had already done something similar with their own public persona. Someone who had built a version of themselves so compelling that audiences had stopped looking for what was underneath it. Someone who could wear that kind of charm on screen and let the audience half believe it. And then, at precise calibrated moments, let just enough through that the half-belief curdled into something more complicated. Carter had written it thinking of no one specific. He had finished it and immediately known who it was for. He had sent it to Dean Martin's people on a Thursday morning. Dean had called him personally on Saturday, not through an agent, not through a manager, personally, from what sounded like a kitchen, with what sounded like a coffee percolating in the background. He had said simply, "I read your script. I think you understand something that most people don't. I'd like to talk." They had talked for 2 hours. At no point during those 2 hours did either of them mention Gerald Holt, who had not yet been attached to the project, who would not be attached for another 3 months, and who, when he eventually read the script, would understand it as a vehicle for star power and marketable darkness, without once grasping what the darkness was actually for. This was the root of the thing, not the nameplate, not the conference room, not even the meeting. The root was simpler and sadder. Gerald Holt had acquired a project he fundamentally did not understand, and rather than acknowledging this, he had decided that the project needed to become something he could understand. He had spent 8 months trying to make Carter Webb's script smaller. He had been one meeting away from succeeding. Dean Martin arrived at 9:47, 13 minutes early, wearing a dark suit that probably cost less than Gerald Holt's tie and somehow looked better. He had a coffee from the cart in the lobby. He was alone, no agent, no assistant, no entourage. He walked in, clocked the nameplate situation in approximately 1 second, looked at it for a moment the way a chess player looks at a board when they've just seen something for moves ahead, and then sat down in a chair at the far end of the table without changing his expression. He put his coffee down. He picked up the script that was sitting in front of each play setting. He began to read. Paul Drexler, who was arranging folders at the side table, watched this happen and felt the specific anxiety of a man who can see a car crash coming from a very long distance and has absolutely no way to stop it. Clint Eastwood arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. He didn't look at the nameplate arrangement. He looked at Dean Martin sitting at the far end of the table reading the script. And he looked at Gerald Holt standing near the window with a phone against his ear, conducting a conversation that he was clearly not planning to end just because Eastwood had entered the room. Clint pulled out the chair next to Dean and sat down. Dean didn't look up from the script. "He moved my nameplate," he said quietly. "I know," Clint said, "just establishing something. I know what he's establishing." Dean turned a page. "What are you going to do about it?" "Depends on what he does next." Dean almost smiled. Almost. That's not reassuring. Wasn't meant to be. Holt finished his phone call. He turned to the room with the expression of a man returning to a stage he owns. "Gentlemen," He sat at the head of the table. He opened his folder. He looked at his notes. And then, without looking up, without the courtesy of eye contact, he said, "Let's talk about the Dean Martin problem." The room went very still. Holt continued, still looking at his notes, still not looking at Dean. "The character as written is charming. Too charming. Test audiences are connecting with him emotionally, which sounds like a good thing. But what it actually means is that they're sympathizing rather than watching. We lose the tension. We lose the danger. We need the character to feel more." He paused, selecting the word with care, which meant he'd chosen it in advance. Compromised. Dean set the script down. "Compromise," he said, "flawed in ways the audience can see clearly, not infer. See." Holt looked up for the first time. "You played charming instinctively, Dean. It's what you do. We need you to play something else. We need to see the drinking, not as background, as character, as something the audience understands is actually true about you." The sentence landed in the room like something dropped from a significant height. Paul Drexler stopped breathing. The two studio liaisons exchanged a microscopic glance. Clint Eastwood, who had been looking at the table, looked up. Dean Martin looked at Gerald Holt for a long moment. His face was entirely calm, entirely readable and entirely unreadable at the same time, which was a trick that took decades to master and couldn't be faked. "Say that one more time," Dean said. "The drinking." The part before that. Holt frowned, a small performance of confusion. "I'm talking about the characters." "You said actually true about you," Dean said. "You were looking at me when you said it. So say it one more time. Look at me and say it again." Holt set his pen down. He leaned back. He made the mistake of smiling. The patient, condescending smile of a man who believes he is managing a situation. "Dean, I've been in this industry for 30 years. I know how to talk to talent. I know how to get the best out of..." "That's not what I asked you. I'm telling you that..." "Gerald." Dean's voice had not risen, had not sharpened, had, if anything, gotten quieter, which was somehow worse than either option. "I have sat in 100 rooms with 100 men who thought that because they had something I wanted, they could say anything they wanted to me, and I have watched, over 30 years, what happened to every single one of those men." He picked up his coffee. He took a sip. He put it down with deliberate gentleness. "Now, I'm going to give you one opportunity to say something different than what you just said, and I want you to think carefully before you use it." The room was not breathing. Gerald Holt, who had not been genuinely threatened in 20 years, felt something new and unpleasant moving through his chest. But he was also, and this was a quality that had sustained him through 3 decades of ruthlessness, incapable of backing down when he believed he held the cards. He believed he held the cards. He had Dean's agent on retainer. He had studio backing. He had leverage on 2 projects that Dean wanted, and one that Eastwood had expressed interest in. He was, by any structural analysis of the situation, the man with the power. "I think," Holt said carefully, "that you're being sensitive about something I raise in a professional context. I think you know that the business requires difficult conversations. And I think..." Clint Eastwood stood up. When Clint Eastwood stood up in a room, the room changed shape. This was not metaphorical. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall and had the physical economy of a man who had spent years learning that stillness was more threatening than motion. When he moved, you watched it the way you watch something in nature move. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because something instinctive in you needed to track it. He walked to the window. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the Paramount lot below, the sound stages, the equipment trucks, the controlled chaos of an industry that manufactured dreams on a factory schedule. Then he turned around. "Gerald," Clint said. His voice was the same voice he used for everything. Conversation, confrontation, the spaces in between. Level, unhurried, carrying in it the particular authority of a man who has never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "How many pictures have you made?" Holt blinked. 19. "How many of them worked?" 14. 14. Clint nodded slowly. "I've looked at your filmography. You want to know what those 14 pictures have in common?" He didn't wait for an answer. Every single one of them had someone in the room. A writer, a director, an actor who was operating at a level you couldn't reach. Someone who understood what the material was actually about. Someone who protected the thing that made it matter. He took a step forward. You know what the other 5 have in common? They didn't have that person. Or they had that person, and you found a way to get them out. Holt's face had changed. The patience was gone. Underneath it was something older and less attractive. I don't know what you think you're doing, Eastwood, but I will tell you that I have relationships in this town that... I'm not finished, Clint said. The 2 words. Quiet. Absolute. Holt stopped. Carter Webb wrote this script. Clint continued. For years, he told me once that this was the best thing he'd ever written. He wasn't wrong. I read it in one sitting, and I don't do that. You know what you've done with it in 8 months? 22 sets of notes. 22. I've read them all. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He set it on the table. I requested them from the studio. 14 of those 22 sets of notes are about removing or diminishing the exact elements that make the script work. The moral ambiguity, the wit, the darkness underneath the charm. He looked at Holt steadily. You've been trying to sand this thing down into something ordinary since the day you got your hands on it. And now you're sitting here telling the man who can actually do what this script requires that his job is to perform his own reputation as a cautionary tale for your test audience. The silence in the room had a physical texture. Paul Drexler was very carefully not looking at anyone. Holt stood up. The instinct, primal, automatic, to reclaim height. You don't understand how this industry works. I understand exactly how it works, Clint said. I understand that you need Dean more than Dean needs you. I understand that the studio attached us to this project because they don't trust you to make it work on your own. I understand that without our names on the poster, this picture doesn't get a wide release, doesn't get a good opening weekend, doesn't justify the budget you've already committed to. He paused. And I understand that you knew all of that when you walked in here this morning, which is why you moved the nameplate. Because you needed to establish something before the meeting started. You needed Dean to feel small, so that you could feel large. Because that's the only way you know how to operate. Holt's mouth opened, closed. The nameplate, Dean said from the far end of the table. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice. But the words arrived in the room with an authority that made the air pressure change. I want to talk about the nameplate, Gerald. Holt turned to look at him. You walked into this room before I arrived, Dean said. You picked up my nameplate, walked it to the end of the table, and put it by the door. The seat you give to people you're about to dismiss. He tilted his head slightly. Now, I've been in this business since I was 23 years old. I have had my name moved in rooms. I have had my rider ignored. I have had my billing changed without notice and my contract renegotiated at the last minute and my scenes cut without consultation. I have dealt with every variety of disrespect that this industry offers. He stood up, slowly, and I have never once in 40 years made a scene about any of it, because I understand that the business is the business and that some things aren't worth the damage. He buttoned his jacket. But I want you to understand something, Gerald. What you did this morning wasn't business. It was personal, and I am going to remember it. Holt made his last mistake. He laughed, while Zanuck walked down 4 flights of stairs to the conference room. Gerald Holt stood in the hallway outside and did something he had not done in a long time. He thought clearly. He reconstructed the morning, the nameplate, a calculated opening, a small but legible assertion of hierarchy, the script notes, prepared in advance, delivered in the specific sequence he had planned, designed to reframe the conversation on his terms before either man could establish their own. The reference to Dean's drinking. This was a card he had been holding for 3 months, the piece of information his contacts had provided, the leverage point he had built into the architecture of the meeting as a failsafe. If Dean resisted the creative direction, Holt could invoke the drinking, not as an attack, as a concern. The industry was full of men who had weaponized concern. It was the cleanest kind of knife. What he had not accounted for was Eastwood in his models of this meeting. And Gerald Holt was a man who constructed detailed mental models of negotiations before entering them. Scenarios branching off scenarios, contingencies stacked on contingencies. Eastwood had been an observer. present, credentialed, commercially valuable, but fundamentally passive. A man who preferred silence to confrontation. A man who would defer to a producer on matters of project direction, because that was what actors did in rooms like this. He had not modeled Eastwood picking up the phone. He had not modeled the internal extension, the directness of it, the calm, standing in the hallway, listening to muffled sounds of the conversation inside, too muffled to make out words, but clear enough to understand tone, and the tone was deeply, definitively not in his favor. Gerald Holt experienced something that arrived without warning and stayed longer than he wanted. Doubt. Real doubt, not the negotiating doubt he used strategically. The performed uncertainty designed to invite concession. Real doubt about whether the cards he was holding were the cards he thought they were. He pushed it down. 20 years of practice. When Richard Zanuck walked past him and opened the conference room door, Holt stepped forward automatically, instinctively, and Zanuck closed the door at his face. Not aggressively, not with malice, with the quiet finality of a man who has already made a decision and is simply executing it. Holt stood in the hallway. The carpet was a deep burgundy. He noticed this for the first time, though he had walked it dozens of times. He could hear dimly the air conditioning cycling in the ceiling above him. Down the hall, a secretary typed something with focused efficiency. The world continued its operations, indifferent to the fact that something Gerald Holt had believed to be permanent had, in the last 11 minutes, ceased to exist. He stood there for 22 minutes. When the door opened and Zanuck walked out, Zanuck looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not unkind, and not angry, and not anything Gerald Holt knew how to read. Then Zanuck said, "I think you should take the rest of the day, Gerald," and walked away down the hall. That was all. No confrontation, no ultimatum, no scene. Gerald Holt had spent his entire career believing that power was loud, that the moment of its exercise would be dramatic and visible. He had imagined, in whatever corner of his mind reserved for catastrophe, that if this day ever came, if the structure he had built ever collapsed, it would collapse with noise, with argument, with a last chance to maneuver. It had collapsed in a sentence. "I think you should take the rest of the day, Gerald." He took the elevator down. He walked through the lobby without seeing it. He drove home on the 101 with the windows up and the radio off. And by the time he reached Bel Air, Gerald Holt had already begun constructing the narrative, the version of events in which what had happened today was a misunderstanding, a temporary rupture, a negotiating tactic by talent that would resolve itself once the industry's short memory moved on to the next disruption. He built the narrative with the same efficiency he brought to everything. He made it coherent. He made it plausible. He would believe it for almost 3 years. It was a short laugh, reflexive, the laugh of a man who has interpreted a threat as a performance and found it unimpressive. It lasted approximately 1 second. Then Clint Eastwood picked up the phone on the conference table. Not his own phone, the room's phone, the direct line that connected to the office of Richard Zanuck, the head of production at the studio, whose name was on the building they were sitting in. He dialed 3 numbers, an internal extension. The phone rang once. "Richard," Clint said, "it's Clint Eastwood. I'm in the conference room on the 4th floor with Dean Martin and Gerald Holt." A pause. "No, not a social call. I need you to come down here." Another pause. "Because in about 10 minutes, Dean and I are going to walk out of this building and withdraw from this project. And I think you should hear why from us directly rather than from Gerald's version of events." He looked at Holt while he said this. Looked at him the way a man looks at a document he is in the process of filing. "Yes, thank you." He hung up. Holt was very still. "You just called Richard Zanuck," he said. "I did." "You can't. That's not. You don't have a standing to." "Gerald." Dean's voice from across the room was almost gentle. "You want to know the difference between you and us? We were never afraid of you. We've been doing this since before you knew what a development deal was. We've survived studios that make this one look like a corner store. We don't need this picture. We don't need your relationships. We don't need your leverage." He picked up his coffee one final time, finished it, set the cup down with a quiet click that sounded, in the silence of the room, like a period at the end of a sentence. "You needed us." Paul Drexler, in the corner, heard the past tense. He reached quietly for his notepad and wrote something down that the room couldn't see. It was a name, not Holt's name. A director he'd been meaning to contact for 6 months. A man with a first-look deal at a different studio who had been looking, Paul happened to know, for exactly the kind of project that Carter Webb's script represented. The meeting, Paul had already understood, was over. What happened next was not the end of anything. It was paperwork. Richard Zanuck arrived 11 minutes later. He was 51 years old, had run production at 20th Century Fox before coming Paramount, and possessed a quality rare in the industry. He could assess a room's damage in under 30 seconds. He stood in the doorway, looked at Gerald Holt, looked at Dean Martin, looked at Clint Eastwood, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Gerald, I think you should step out. This is my..." Gerald. Holt stepped out. The conversation that followed lasted 22 minutes. Zanuck asked questions. Clint answered most of them. Dean answered the rest. Paul Drexler, who had technically not been dismissed, sat in his corner and wrote notes that Holt would never see, because Paul had, in those 22 minutes, mentally resigned from his position and begun constructing the pitch he would make the following morning to the production company he'd been in quiet conversation with for 4 months. At the end of 22 minutes, Zanuck stood up. "I'll have Gerald's office clear the project file by Friday," he said. "If you two are still interested in the picture, I'd like to discuss a new producing arrangement." Dean looked at Clint. Clint looked at Dean. Something passed between them. Not a conversation. Something older than conversation. The recognition of two people who understand each other's calibration, who have independently arrived at the same calculation and found it correct. "We're interested," Clint said. Gerald Holt spent 3 hours on the phone that afternoon. He called his attorney first, then his agent, then 4 studio contacts who had, over the previous decade, taken his calls immediately and urgently. The attorney returned his call within the hour, the agent within 2. The 4 studio contacts, a vice president of production, a head of distribution, a senior development executive, and a man who had owed Holt a professional favor for 7 years, did not return his calls that day. 2 of them returned calls the following week. The conversations were brief and professionally warm and entirely devoid of the substance Holt needed. The project went into turnaround. Officially, Gerald Holt's name was removed from the packaging with a speed that should have told him everything, but which he interpreted as a temporary setback, a negotiating position, a problem that could be solved with enough phone calls to enough people. Carter Webb, the man who had written the script, heard what had happened in the conference room from Paul Drexler, who called him that evening. Carter Webb, who had spent 4 years writing the best thing he had ever written and 18 months watching it be slowly dismantled by a man who didn't understand what it was, listened to the account in silence. When Paul finished, Carter said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Is it still available?" "As of Friday," Paul said. "I have a call on Monday," Carter said, "with a director who's been asking about it for a year." The picture was made 16 months later. Different producer, different studio. The director who had been asking about it for a year, a man who had come up to the European art house circuit and had a visual intelligence that was almost painful in its precision, brought something to material that even Carter's writing hadn't fully anticipated. Dean Martin's performance was described by 3 separate critics as the best work of his career. Not the most charming, not the most effortless. The best, a word they used carefully, knowing what it meant. Clint Eastwood received an offer for a different project from Zanuck's office 6 weeks later. He read the script in one sitting. He said yes. Gerald Holt produced 2 more pictures. Neither of them worked. The second one, a crime picture, ironically, set in Las Vegas, went $9 million over budget and underperformed so significantly at the box office that the studio absorbed the loss without comment, which is what studios do when they've already decided that a relationship is over and are simply waiting for the appropriate moment to formalize the conclusion. His office at Paramount was cleared on a Thursday. Security sent a box. The box was left at reception. He collected it on a Friday morning, alone, and carried it to his car and drove back to his house in Bel Air and sat in his study and looked at the phone. It did not ring. Paul Drexler, in an interview given decades later to a film historian working on a book about the production culture of 1960s Hollywood, was asked about the incident. He had, by that point, produced 11 pictures, 3 of which had been nominated for Academy Awards, 2 of which had won. He was 64 years old and had the patient, considered manner of man who had seen enough of the industry to understand it without bitterness. The historian asked, was the nameplate really the thing that started it? Paul Drexler thought about this for a moment. The nameplate was a symptom, he said finally. The disease was a belief that talent is a resource you extract rather than a relationship you build. Gerald thought he understood leverage. He understood the mechanics of leverage, contracts, deals, obligations. What he didn't understand is that leverage only works on people who need what you have. Dean Martin and Clint Eastwood didn't need what he had. They needed the script. The script existed without Gerald. Gerald needed them to exist as a producer. He paused. What Clint did, picking up that phone, calling Zanuck directly in the room while Gerald was watching, that wasn't a power move. It wasn't even tactical. It was clarifying. He was just making visible what had always been true, that the room belonged to the people who could actually make the thing, not the person who had found a way to put his name on the paperwork. The historian asked, what did you take from it? Paul Drexler smiled. It was the smile of a man remembering something with great precision. I learned that the most dangerous person in any room, he said, is the one who has nothing to prove and knows it. He looked out the window. Dean Martin put his nameplate back at the head of the table before he left that day. Just moved it back like it was nothing, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He shook his head slightly. He never mentioned it, never made a thing of it, just put it where it belonged and walked out. The historian wrote this down. And Holt, the historian asked, did he ever understand what had happened? Paul considered this for a long time. I think, he said carefully, that's the saddest part of the whole story. Men like Gerald, they understand events. They understand what happened. The phone call, the meeting ending, the project going away. They understand the sequence. What they don't understand is the reason. Why it happened to them specifically. Why the room turned the way it did. He paused. Because understanding the reason would require understanding what they are. And what they are is the one thing they spent their whole careers avoiding looking at directly. He stood up from his chair. The interview was over. At the door, he stopped. That nameplate, he said, without turning around. Gerald moved it to establish something, to tell Dean who was in charge before the meeting even started. He finally turned. What he didn't realize was that Dean saw it the moment he walked in, processed it, decided everything he needed to decide, and then sat down in that chair by the door and waited. He opened the door. Dean Martin let Gerald Holt walk into a room where everything had already been decided. Paul said, and spent an hour believing he was winning. He left. The historian sat alone in the empty room for a long moment, then wrote, in the margin of his notes, for words, the chair by the door. Some men move the nameplate. Some men let them. The difference is who's still in the room when the story gets told. Dean Martin and Clint Eastwood walked out of the Paramount building at 12:17 in the afternoon. The sun was doing what Los Angeles sun does in April, aggressive, whitening everything, turning the concrete of the lot into something that looked almost beautiful from a distance and was merely hot up close. Dean put on his sunglasses. Clint didn't bother. They stood on the steps for a moment. Neither of them spoke. This was not awkward. It was the silence of two people who had just done something together and are letting it settle. A grip rolled a cable cart past them without looking up. Somewhere across the lot, someone was shouting directions for a crane shot. You rehearsed the Parasite line. Dean said finally, some of it. The part about the 5 films? I had Paul pull the box office on a Tuesday. Dean almost laughed. Almost. You were planning this. I was prepared for it, Clint said. There was a difference in his voice between the two things. I read that stack of notes the week after I sign on. 22 sets. I counted. And you said nothing. I was waiting to see if it would fix itself. It didn't fix itself. No, Clint agreed. It didn't. Dean looked out at the lot, at the controlled, industrious chaos of people making things. He had spent 40 years inside this machinery. He understood its rhythms and its cruelties and its specific, stubbornly persistent beauty. The way a good day on a good set felt like nothing else in the world, and the way the industry surrounded that field was so much that was transactional and ugly that you had to fight to remember why you were there. "The kid," Dean said. "Paul. He's going to be good." Clint nodded. He had thought the same thing, watching Paul Drexler navigate the room. The careful stillness, the notes he was writing that Holt would never see, the small, precise intelligence of a young man who understood that the most important thing happening in a room was not the argument between the powerful people, but the structural reality it was revealing. "He'll be out of there by the end of the week," Clint said. "Probably Thursday." Dean agreed. A studio car pulled up, Dean's ride. The driver got out and opened the door without being asked. Dean buttoned his jacket, the small gesture of a man completing a transition from one context to another, from the room to the street, from the version of himself required for a confrontation to the version required for everything else. "The script is good," Dean said. He wasn't talking to Clint. He was stating a fact that needed to be said out loud, in the open, in the afternoon light, as a kind of corrective to mourning. Carter wrote something real. It deserves to get made right. "It will," Clint said. Dean looked at him. "How do you know?" Clint looked back. The unhurried gaze of a man who does not deal in certainty, but has calculated probability with considerable care. Because the people who understood it are still on it. And the person who didn't understand it is upstairs trying to reach people who stopped answering. Dean considered this. "You know what the worst part is?" Dean said quietly. He moved the nameplate. He thought about that. He walked in early. He picked it up. He carried it to the other end of the table. He did that intentionally. He paused. "That's a lot of effort to make someone feel small before a meeting even starts. That's not confidence. That's fear." He shook his head. "The most frightened people I've ever met in this industry are the ones who need everyone else to be smaller. Because if someone in the room is their actual size, they can't hold the room anymore." He got in the car, through the open window. "Tell Carter the script is going to be fine." The window went up. The car pulled away into the Los Angeles afternoon, moving through a city that manufactured illusions for a living and occasionally, accidentally, made something true. Clint Eastwood stood on the steps for another moment. Then he walked his own car, got in, and drove north on the 101 toward a quiet house in Carmel, where there was no phone call he needed to make, and no room he needed to manage, and nothing required of him except his own company, which he had always found sufficient. The morning had taken 4 hours. It had ended a career without raising a voice, without making a threat, without a single moment of visible anger. Just a phone, just a past tense, just a nameplate moved back to where it belonged, and a chair by the door, in which a man had sat very quietly and waited for the room to show him exactly what it was.